Welcome to the first of two mini lectures on the logos appeal. This is one of the key and foundational aspects of our course in rhetoric and argument. I'd like to walk through the elements of the logos appeal, including the multifaceted ways that you can use logic and reasoning as argumentative appeals to advance a particular case inside an argument that you're making. So, as you know, the logos appeal, the idea of the logos appeal, calling it such, comes to us from Aristotle, who is here on the right, or at least a bust of Aristotle, an artistic rendering of him. And Aristotle concedes in his book Rhetoric that the pathos appeal may in fact be the most persuasive of the rhetorical appeals, the appeal to emotion, but he contends that the most important rhetorical appeal is the logos appeal, that is, the appeal to logic and reason. The idea behind this is evident in multiple texts that came from Aristotle. Across his works, he argues that what differentiates humankind from all other animals on the planet is that we have the capacity for rationality. We are reasoning creatures. So in other words, our ability to think, our ability to make claims and support those claims with evidence, to act in accordance with our beliefs, to scrutinize and analyze the world, including the ideas of other people, all of that makes us unique animals, and we therefore have an obligation to understand about the ways that logic and reason work and how we can employ logic and reason on our own. In rhetorical studies, we know that an argument can be understood as a claim, that is, a debatable proposition, that is supported by evidence. That is, the reasons that support or defend the claim, the specific information given to advance, defend, support, and so forth, the debatable proposition that's being put forward. And then an argument also needs to have some sufficient counter argument to it that would help show why other positions on the same topic don't come as close to the right outcome as our own position. So in a counter argument, we would look at the argument that our opponents are making, and we would engage in explaining why their particular take on the topic is incorrect, or even going so far as to provide a critique or a rebuttal or a refutation to the claims and evidence that they provide. Aristotle says there are really two kinds of evidence that can be given to support a claim. In other words, there are two ways of using the logos appeal in an argument. One is argument by example, and the other is argument by enthymeme. Enthymeme is one of those concepts like logos and pathos and kairos, where we're relying on the Greek term here, and we'll get closer to explaining what that term means later. Right now, let's take a step back and not think about the word enthymeme. Let's not let the word itself deter us from understanding the concept. Example and enthymeme correspond approximately to two foundational approaches to reasoning, what's called inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. What I'd like to do in these mini lectures on the logos appeal is explain how inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning work with some examples. And when we get to the end, you should be well prepared to be able to describe how you are making arguments. And when you look at someone else's attempts to reason their way through an argument, you should be able to tell the difference between what is an argument by example and what is an argument by enthymeme. Before we get there, let's just take a second to define the concept of logic. At its core, logic, which is where we get the word from logos, is the process for determining which arguments are good, that is, which ones are rational, and which arguments are bad, that is, which arguments are irrational. A rational argument corresponds to our reason, our intellectual capabilities, whereas an irrational argument is not rational. It's not reasonable. It's not logical. We have to be able to engage in this skill to present our own arguments. And we also have to be able to engage in the skill of logic to analyze the arguments of other people. In a way, reasoning and logic are just extensions of this overall idea of critical thinking that I introduced a few mini lectures ago. And the reason that they're so important for us to understand is good reasoning, that is very logical reasoning, is not necessarily persuasive. It's important to remember that just because it's logical, that doesn't make it de facto persuasive. It needs to be paired with other rhetorical strategies in order to be fully persuasive. Bad reasoning, that is, our reasoning that's not logical at all or highly irrational, is sometimes quite persuasive. So even if it fails to pass the sniff test on logic, it can nevertheless be persuasive, depending on the context, depending on the audience, depending on the person who's delivering it. That makes the ability to analyze the arguments and to determine what's reasonable and logical all the more important when we know that the quality of the reasoning does not necessarily depend on its persuasiveness. Socrates argues in the defense that logical argumentation should take precedence over mere persuasion. And he points out that persuasion is not always ethical or just. Logic is essentially a skill of dissection, then. The ability to take something and have it in front of us and to take it apart piece by piece and part by part and see how the parts function. Being able to separate the reasoning from the persuasive tactics, then being able to evaluate the reasoning independently from those persuasive tactics will help us decide whether to accept or reject an argument. It will help us determine, even though the reasoning might seem persuasive on the surface, we need to subject it to a closer eye, a closer level of analysis to determine, does it really have the facts and the evidence and the logic behind it that makes it a position that we should accept for ourselves? We also have to remember, as we're getting into a discussion of the logos appeal, that good reasoning in the construction of an argument is not merely taking a pre-existing position and then finding evidence to support that position. This is, I think, one of the unfortunate side effects of some college writing courses, where you get an assignment that says, write a 5 to 7 page paper on a controversial political issue and advance your position argumentatively. A lot of people at that moment, what they do is they pick a position that they already have a relatively strong opinion on or a relatively solid belief on, and then they go find reasons in support of that position. But see, good reasoning entails securing good evidence. So we start first with learning about the concept. Then we have to follow that evidence where it leads. Then we can draw a conclusion from that evidence, and only then can we use evidence to advance our position in an argument when we're called to do so. So good reasoning necessarily entails understanding what counts as good evidence. Perhaps you put in the preliminary work of understanding a position then, right? And so being a good critical thinker might say, well, I've already worked a lot on a particular idea, or I've read a lot on a particular topic. I already know where I stand because I have examined a lot of evidence, and then I would find strong evidence to help support that position. That's okay if that is the case. But good reasoning and logical skills are not just saying, this is what I believe because this is what I've always been told I should believe. Now I need to go find reasons to explain why that is. We'll talk about that when we get to errors in reasoning in a couple of weeks. But it's also important to recognize that this process of looking through evidence and following evidence and drawing conclusions from evidence might mean that as you learn more, or as you are exposed to different kinds of evidence, your mind, your opinion, your thoughts about a topic could actually change. And there's nothing wrong with changing a position based on new evidence. In fact, in a lot of ways, that's really the heart of the academic life. Learning something new and allowing your mental register and your mental awareness of that topic to be updated accordingly. It may be updated to a stronger position on that topic. It might be downgraded to a weaker position on that topic. It could change the position on the topic completely. One just doesn't know until one is looking at the evidence and considering what kind of evidence is logical, is effective, is reasonable, is persuasive ultimately to you. So let's start. We're going to start with argument by example. This is one of the key ideas that Aristotle puts forward in the rhetoric for one of the branches of the Logos appeal. An argument by example, another way to think about that is a kind of argument by inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning that I think most of us are familiar with on a terminology level, or the idea of thinking about how it works. I think we're actually all familiar with each aspect of the Logos appeal, but we may not be familiar with the specific words or the ways of talking about it. I do think we're going to be familiar with inductive reasoning, though. So tell me if you've heard this one before, right? You get started with a question based on something that you've noticed. You generate this question that you want to learn more about. In a lot of college writing courses, this is called your research question. So you have a question, and you're going to go out and you're going to learn more about the topic. And as you learn more, the hope is your opinion will become more and more solidified until you find a position on a topic strong enough that you feel like you want to make an argument about it. Let's say you've noticed that many states in America are legalizing cannabis for recreational use. Perhaps your state isn't one of them, but you've noticed there are, a couple dozen states that have, and so it's a thoughtful question to ask: should our state legalize cannabis for recreational use? So now we have a question. And with that question in mind, we can start to do some research on it. And we would want to, as we're going through the research, think, what do the data suggest about this question? What would be the benefits if this position was adopted? Would there be any consequences? If so, what would those consequences be? If you have benefits and you have consequences, next you have to say, well, do the benefits outweigh the consequences? Or is it vice versa? Do the consequences outweigh the benefits? The states that have legalized it, how are they doing? in terms of their budgets, in terms of their crime rates, in terms of their tax base, in terms of their economy, in terms of traffic accidents, right? How are the states doing that have legalized cannabis for recreational use? Once we know the outcomes in some of those states, would those outcomes be likely in our state? And if those outcomes are likely in our state, and most of the outcomes have benefits as opposed to consequences, is that an argument for why we should legalize it as well? This is logos concept number one. We draw conclusions from evidence. We go out, we find evidence, we find examples of something in the world, and then we use the evidence or we use those examples to support our claims. It's like two triangles that are connected at the top point of each triangle. You start from a very broad base of evidence and you narrow down into a conclusion. Then at the top of the other triangle, that becomes the claim that is supported by the evidence. The gathering of evidence to support a claim is the most common form of inductive reasoning that occurs within college contexts. It's very likely you've written an argumentative research paper at some point in the past where you have a claim and you are advancing that claim through the support of research that you have found evidence in favor of that claim. Evidence that then becomes sources, sources that then you have to cite, sources that you are quoting from or paraphrasing from or summarizing. We know that evidence needs to hit a couple of criteria to be considered good evidence depending on the audience. Evidence needs to be relevant. It needs to be timely. It needs to be credible. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be fair. It needs to be representative. And in the coming weeks, we will turn to conducting solid academic research, and we'll talk about what evidence is going to be acceptable in a college class like ours. When all the evidence is laid out, it can create a really overwhelming sense of unity in the paper. You have evidence from 10 sources. The evidence is strong from all 10 of those sources. It can put forward a persuasive case on the claim that you're advancing. But what constitutes good evidence is always going to depend on the situation and is always going to depend on the context of the argument, right? If I'm having an argument with my spouse about where we should go for breakfast one morning, and my evidence is going to be pulled from a peer-reviewed academic journal, that's probably a little bit of overkill. But if as evidence or an example I offer up, last week you picked where we went for breakfast, so this week I would like to pick where we go for breakfast, that's a pretty good a piece of evidence in my favor if we are inclined to take turns and share who decides where we go for breakfast on Friday mornings. In the coming weeks, we're also going to discuss errors in cognition that lead us to misunderstand evidence or mistake relationships between evidence. But for right now, as we're just establishing what are the concepts around the logos appeal, it's important to establish that when we talk about the logos appeal, one thing that we're talking about is evidence. Just as when we're talking about the ethos appeal, we're talking about your educational level, your professionalism, your ability to connect with the audience based on your personal background. And when we talk about the pathos appeal, we're talking about what are the emotions that you want your audience to feel, and what are the emotions that you want to be expressing, and how do different emotions affect the direction of an argument. When we talk about logos, one of the things that we're talking about is evidence. In rhetoric, Aristotle writes, or is quoted as saying, whether our argument concerns public affairs or some other subject, we must know some, if not all, of the facts about the subject on which we are to speak and argue. Otherwise, we can have no materials out of which to construct arguments. I mean, for instance, how could we advise the Athenians whether they should go to war or not, if we did not know their strength, whether it was naval or military or both, and how great it is, what their revenues amount to, who their friends and enemies are, what wars too they have waged, and with what success, and so on. So to answer a should or ought or argumentative debatable claim, we need to have background information at the ready. From learning all from that background information, we are then able to formulate a conclusion. From that conclusion, we are able to turn the conclusion into a claim, otherwise known as a thesis statement. And then once we've made our thesis statement, we are able to use evidence in support of that claim. You're probably familiar with a process that looks a little bit like this. This is the very common outline for a college paper or essay, right? Where you have the claim at the top, or your thesis statement, the debatable idea that's driving your paper forward. In this case, let's say our claim is our state should legalize cannabis for recreational use. Then we offer up what are the grounds for supporting that claim. Let's say one of the grounds that we want to offer for supporting that claim is that the tax revenue that comes from the legalization of recreational cannabis is quite large. And then let's provide pieces of evidence drawn from the research that will back up that idea. So we can't just say it will increase the tax base. We have to point to, well, in this state, once they legalized cannabis for recreational use, this many millions of dollars came in, and they were able to use that money in support of the following initiatives. If our state did that, we're estimated to take in this many millions of dollars in tax revenue. That money could be invested into the following things to help support people, so on and so forth. So we draw information from the research to make up our mind. Then once we've made up our mind, we take the information from the research and we use it to support the claim that we're making. How does Socrates use evidence in the defense? Well, consider the evidence that he provides in the defense for why he has not corrupted the youth. He doesn't have an academic peer-reviewed journal to turn to. It doesn't quite work like that, but he is able to point to specific examples related to his case that he believes helps make his argument that he has not, quote unquote, corrupted the youth. One, the young men who follow him and imitate him do so of their own accord. He has not recruited them. He is not charging them money. They have decided to follow him and learn from him on their own. If he was doing it by himself, he would be doing the exact same thing. If he has 100 people watching him, learning from him how to do it, he would be doing the exact same thing. That is the argument that he puts forward. Piece of evidence number one, I did not make anybody engage in this. They did so on their own. Evidence number two, he says the people who are angry with the young men who follow him and imitate him are taking their anger out on Socrates because they're unwilling to admit the source of their anger. He says it's their unjust or their unwise ways. They're not willing to change the way that they interact with others or the way they govern Athens. And so instead, they're going to take out their anger on Socrates. And in doing so, he becomes an easy target for them, as opposed to going after all of the young men who follow him. They just can go straight after him. He says also, what he's given to Athens is a net benefit, not a harm. And even if his services were a harm, he says they weren't an intentional harm. He didn't set out intending to harm Athens. He set out intending to help Athens. And the right way, if somebody has committed an unintentional error, is to take them aside and correct them, not prosecute them and take them, put them on trial. Socrates also offers up that none of the so-called corrupted have been brought forward to testify against him. That the prosecutors are saying, well, he's corrupted the youth, but they can't actually find anybody to bring forward as a witness against Socrates to demonstrate that they've been corrupted. Instead, they're relying on Socrates' ill reputation. They're relying on guilt by association. They're relying on a caricature of Socrates, he says. Finally, Meletus cannot identify a single other person in all of Athens who is guilty of quote unquote corrupting the youth. Socrates offers up this point as evidence that the charge itself is not really to be taken very seriously, that it is sort of a boosted charge in order to get him to be convicted, and that the charge itself is really more about just satisfying an emotional appeal of getting rid of the man like Socrates, and perhaps trying to send some sort of shockwave through education in Athens, and that if it really were the case that Socrates and his teaching were